She could have died out there.
You let that black girl touch your mother? The voice wasn't loud, but it didn't have to be. Every head in the diner turned, every breath seemed to freeze mid-air. Zarya stood still, her hands wrapped gently around a chipped white mug, steam rising between her fingers as she offered it to the fragile old woman sitting by the window. She didn't flinch. She was used to the looks, the whispers, the offhand comments that cut deeper than most people realized. Zarya had learned to meet them all with the same thing, a soft smile and a kind word.
I want you.
But that question, that tone,
Just as you
it hurt
are.
more than she let on. Outside,
Yes.
snow slammed against the windows in thick, relentless sheets. The forecast had warned of the worst blizzard in a decade, and by nightfall, nearly every business in Aspen had shut down. Except this tiny roadside diner barely heated, barely staffed. Just Zarya. She was the one who kept the coffee warm and the lights on, not for tips, not for recognition, but because, somewhere along the line, she decided that dignity didn't depend on who was watching. The old woman Margaret had stumbled in just after closing, her coat soaked, her fingers trembling, her face pale with something more than cold. No one wanted to help her, but Zarya did. She wrapped her coat around her, sat her down, made her tea, listened when she talked, really listened. And that decision? That quiet act of decency? By morning, it would explode into something no one expected, not even Zarya. Because Margaret had a son, and that son had power, and money, and a name that echoed in boardrooms and tech empires. And when he walked in the next day, demanding to know who touched his mother, Zarya stood tall. This isn't just a story about snow. It's about race, about pride, about what it means to show up for someone when no one else will. This is a black story, and it's one the world needs to hear. You're watching Hidden Worth, and if you believe kindness is strength, not weakness, stay with us. This is just the beginning. Zarya Monroe was the kind of woman people noticed, just not for the reasons she deserved. At 24, she had that quiet kind of beauty that lingered. Warm cinnamon skin that glowed under the soft light of the diner, almond-shaped eyes full of story and strength, and a smile that felt like sunrise after a long winter night. Her hair thick, coiled, unapologetically natural, was usually tied back in a simple bun. Her figure? Strong, elegant, shaped by long shifts on her feet and early mornings spent helping her grandmother before work. But none of that seemed to matter to the customers who walked into the diner. To them, she was just the black girl who serves coffee. Or worse, that pretty little thing with attitude, as one regular once called her, loud enough for her to hear. She remembered that day. A group of men in construction gear sat near the back booth. One of them had leaned over and whispered something to his buddy, then laughed too loud. "Black Barbie's got sass," he'd said, looking Zarya up and down like she was a menu item. She smiled, politely, professionally, and walked away before her hands started shaking. She was used to the comments, the assumptions. People thought they could measure her worth in tips and side glances. But Zarya carried herself with a grace that didn't ask for permission. She greeted every customer with the same warm tone, remembered names, refilled coffee without being asked. Even when the remarks stung, even when someone accidentally touched her hair or asked if she spoke proper English, she held her ground. What most people didn't know was that Zarya had once been on the dean's list. That she had a scholarship letter from one of the top business schools in the country still folded in a drawer under a framed photo of her late mother. She'd turned it down, chose to stay, to care for her grandmother after the stroke, because loyalty, to her, meant more than ambition. And so, she served tables, wiped counters, laughed with regulars, held herself with quiet pride, even as the world tried to put her in a smaller box. What no one realized, what they chose not to see, was that Zarya was the kind of woman storms couldn't shake. The kind who could change everything, without ever raising her voice. And she was about to. The old woman came in like a ghost, silent, shaking, and half buried in snow. It was just past 10 p.m. when the diner's front door creaked open again. Most folks were long gone, rushing home before the storm trapped them for the night. But Zarya stayed behind, wiping down tables and humming softly to herself. The wind pushed the door hard, and for a second, All she saw was white, snow swirling in like fog, coating the entryway. Then, through the haze, a frail figure appeared, small, hunched over, wrapped in what looked like an outdated wool coat 2 sizes too big. Her gloves were mismatched, and her shoes soaked through. Her face was pale, her lips trembling, and her eyes carried stories. "Ma'am," Zarya called gently, stepping out from behind the counter. "Are you okay?" The woman didn't speak. She just blinked slowly, like she was trying to place where she was. Zarya rushed forward, careful not to startle her. "Come inside, please. It's too cold out there." She helped the woman inside, guiding her to the booth near the heater. Her clothes were damp, her skin ice cold to the touch. Zarya didn't hesitate. She peeled off her own jacket and wrapped it around the woman's shoulders. "Let me get you something warm," she said, already heading to the back for tea. She chose chamomile, something soft, comforting. When she returned, the woman was still staring out the window, like she wasn't really there. But as Zarya placed the mug in front of her, those tired eyes finally shifted and focused. "Thank you," the woman whispered, voice hoarse. Zarya smiled. "You're welcome." The woman looked at her again, longer this time, studying her face like it was familiar. Then, out of nowhere, she asked, "Do you believe in fate?" Zarya blinked. "Excuse me?" "Fate," the woman repeated. "Do you think people meet for a reason?" It was a strange question from a stranger, but something in the way she asked it didn't feel random. It felt like the beginning of something. Zarya didn't know it yet, but the woman sitting in that booth wasn't just cold and lost. She wasn't homeless. She wasn't senile. She was Margaret Riker, and she was looking for someone, or maybe something. And that night, in a near-empty diner in the middle of a blizzard, she found it in a waitress with a kind heart and warm hands. The next morning started like any other winter day in Aspen, white, bitter, and far too quiet. Snow blanketed every rooftop, every car, every corner of the road. The sky was still gray, like it hadn't decided whether to keep snowing or give the town a break. Zarya had come in early, as always. She shoveled the sidewalk outside the diner, humming a gospel tune her grandmother used to play on Sunday mornings. Inside, the heat was slow to kick in, so she moved quickly, turning on the coffee machines and checking the stock. She hadn't seen Margaret yet. The old woman had stayed the night in the small back room normally used for storing canned goods and cleaning supplies. Zarya had made her a cot from folded blankets and extra uniforms, added a space heater, and made sure she had water and crackers before bed. Zarya didn't ask why Margaret hadn't called anyone, didn't press her about where she came from or who might be looking for her. Some people just need space to breathe, and Zarya understood that better than most. At 8:02 a.m., a deep rumble cut through the calm. Zarya glanced out the frosted front window and saw it, a sleek black SUV, tires still spinning in the snow, pulling up right in front of the diner. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped to the door, just as a tall man stepped out of the vehicle. He was dressed in a sharp navy coat, expensive leather gloves, and boots that didn't belong anywhere near slush. His jaw was tight. His steps were fast. His presence didn't ask for attention, it demanded it. The bell above the diner door jingled as he stepped inside. Zarya offered her usual smile. "Morning, can I help you?" His eyes swept the room once, then locked onto her like a target. "Where is she?" he asked. Zarya blinked. "I'm sorry?" "My mother," he snapped. "She was here last night. Margaret Riker." Before she could respond, Margaret's voice called out from the back. "Elliot?" He turned toward the sound, relief flickering across his face, but just for a second. Then his eyes went back to Zarya, and they were cold again. "You let my mother stay here?" he said, tone sharp. Zarya held her ground. She was cold and alone. "I did what anyone decent would do." His mouth tightened. Not everyone would agree. And just like that, the air turned colder than the storm outside. Zarya had faced judgment before, but never like this. The air inside the diner felt heavier than the storm clouds outside. Elliot Riker stood tall in the middle of the room, his coat still dusted with snow, his glare slicing through her like a blade. A man used to boardrooms, not diners. Power, not gratitude. "You let her sleep in a storage closet?" he asked, voice low but sharp. With no medical attention, no phone call, no permission? Zarya kept her tone steady. She refused a hospital. Said she just needed to warm up. I respected that. Elliot shook his head, his jaw tight. And you didn't think to call anyone? A stranger shows up out of nowhere, in the middle of a blizzard, and you just take her in? I didn't see a stranger, Zarya said quietly. I saw a human being in danger. The diner had started to fill regulars, mostly. People who knew Zarya by name, by heart. But in that moment, none of them stood up. They just watched, whispered. Some leaned closer to catch every word. A woman by the counter nudged her friend and said under her breath, "Bet she's trying to get something out of it. Wouldn't be the first time." Another voice, an older man near the coffee pot, chimed in. "You know how it is. Act sweet, play the victim, then cry when it backfires." Zarya heard it all. She always did. And still she didn't waver. Margaret appeared from the back, wrapped in Zarya's jacket, her steps slow but determined. "Elliot," she said, her voice soft but firm. "That's enough." He turned to her, eyes softening. "Mom, are you all right?" "I am," she said, looking between him and Zarya. "Because of her." He looked back at Zarya again, but something in his gaze shifted confusion. Maybe. Doubt. "I don't understand," he muttered. "Why would you help her?" Margaret smiled faintly. "Because she saw me when no one else did." The room went quiet. Even the whisperers had nothing to say. Zarya stood there, chin lifted, shoulders square, not angry, not afraid, just grounded. She had done the right thing. And in a world that often made her feel invisible, that mattered more than anyone's opinion. This wasn't about charity. It wasn't about status. It was about dignity, and the quiet power of choosing to do good even when no one gives you credit for it. Elliot Riker stood in the middle of the diner like he didn't quite know how he got there. For a man who ran multi-million-dollar mergers before breakfast, this apologizing in a place that smelled like bacon grease and floor cleaner felt foreign. But then again, nothing about this morning was normal. His mother was sipping tea in a borrowed coat. The waitress he had just accused of negligence was now the reason she was alive, and every eye in the room was waiting for him to say something human. He hated that. "I may have been out of line," he muttered, voice low, like the words were being dragged from his throat. "I apologize." Zarya didn't blink, didn't flinch, just met his gaze with steady eyes and a calm that unnerved him more than any boardroom challenge ever had. She didn't say, "It's okay," didn't rush to make it easier for him. She let the silence sit between them like a test. Margaret broke it gently. "Elliot," she said, folding her hands on the table. "Look at this girl. She gave me her coat, her food, her warmth, and never once asked me who I was." Elliot exhaled slowly. "Thank you," he said again, this time a little clearer. "For taking care of her." Zarya gave a small nod. "You're welcome." He shifted on his feet. "If there's anything I can do to repay you, money, resources, even a job connection." "I didn't do this for a favor," she said softly but firmly, "and I'm not a charity case." "I didn't mean it like that," he said, but even to his own ears it sounded weak. Margaret stood up, steadying herself with one hand on the booth. "Zarya, would you come to dinner with us tonight? Our home is warm, and I cook better than I look." Zarya smiled, for the first time that morning. "I don't know. I've had some bad luck with rich people lately." That made Margaret laugh, a light, raspy sound full of sincerity. "Fair enough." Elliot cleared his throat. "It would be a small gesture of gratitude, that's all." Zarya studied him. He wasn't used to being studied like this, like he was being measured for something other than money. Finally, she nodded. "All right, one dinner." He gave a clipped nod, all business. Zarya turned back to the counter, refilling a coffee pot like nothing had changed. But something had. Not everything needed to be forgiven, not right away. But sometimes, the smallest shift, the softest word could start something neither of them saw coming. Zarya had seen big houses before, but never like this. The Riker estate sat on the edge of Aspen's wealthiest ridge, perched like a modern castle among the snow-covered pines. Steel, glass and stone stretched across the property in sharp, elegant lines. Every window glowed warm against the icy dusk, like it was defying winter itself. The driver opened the door for her. Zarya stepped out slowly, her boots crunching against the perfectly shoveled driveway. She had borrowed a soft wool coat from a coworker and worn her nicest dress, simple, navy blue, paired with a silver necklace her grandmother gave her on her 18th birthday. Still, she felt out of place. Inside, the contrast was sharper. Everything gleamed, floors polished like mirrors, walls filled with art she couldn't name, chandeliers that looked like they belonged in museums. A housekeeper led her in without a smile, barely hiding the confusion in her eyes. "She's with us," Margaret said from the staircase, walking down in a soft burgundy shawl. "Make sure she's treated like family." Zarya smiled politely, but the tension clung to her like static. Dinner was served in a room bigger than her entire apartment. Long mahogany table, fine china, fire crackling behind a glass screen, 2 chefs, 3 servers, and yet the space still felt cold. Elliot sat at the head of the table, posture perfect, watching everything. Zarya said little at first. She answered politely, smiled when it felt right, ate slowly, observed. But then Margaret started talking, asking about Zarya's childhood, her favorite books, the music her mother used to play. And Zarya's voice began to fill the room. Her laugh, soft at first, grew easier. Her stories painted pictures. Her warmth reached places the fire couldn't. That's when Elliot started to see her differently. Not as a waitress, not as a girl from the other side of town, but as someone whole. He noticed how she addressed the servers by name, thanked them for every plate, how she helped Margaret adjust her shawl without making a scene, how she never once looked around the mansion with envy, just quiet curiosity. He realized he'd been wrong, about who she was, about what mattered. After dessert, Margaret excused herself early. Zarya helped her up the stairs, steady and gentle. Elliot watched from the bottom step, something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Maybe gratitude, maybe guilt, or maybe, for the first time in a long time, something like admiration. 2 nights later, the Riker estate buzzed with laughter, clinking glasses, and the smooth hum of a jazz quartet playing near the grand fireplace. The annual Riker Foundation Charity Gala had begun, an event where Aspen's elite gathered to sip wine, smile for cameras, and pretend winter didn't exist for people without heated driveways. Zarya hadn't planned to come. But Margaret insisted. "You've already survived my son," she joked. "You can survive a few snobs in tuxedos." Zarya wore a deep emerald dress that hugged her figure without showing too much. Her curls were pinned back loosely, a few strands framing her face. She looked radiant, but the discomfort in her eyes lingered. The moment she stepped into the ballroom, she felt it. The stares. Polite curiosity wrapped in judgment, people smiling too tightly, eyes flicking from her dress to her skin to her proximity to Elliot. She knew this game. Elliot stood across the room, locked in conversation with a board member. But his eyes kept drifting back to her, not with shame but concern, maybe even protection. It happened near the hors d'oeuvres table. A woman in a red sequined gown, holding a flute of champagne like a dagger, leaned in and asked Zarya casually, "So, what department are you with? Catering? Or maybe you're Elliot's new personal assistant?" Her tone was sweet, her smile wasn't. Zarya responded calmly, "Actually, I was invited by his mother." The woman blinked. "Oh, I just assumed, well, never mind." Another guest nearby snorted. Didn't realize this year's theme was charity with extra flavor. Zarya's jaw clenched. Before she could speak, a voice cut through the air. "Elliot." "She's not charity," he said firmly, stepping between them, "and she doesn't need to explain why she's here. But maybe you do." Silence. The music kept playing, but the room had shifted. Later that night, after the guests left, Margaret and Zarya sat alone in the library, nursing mugs of herbal tea. "You know," Margaret said gently, "I didn't just wander into your diner that night." Zarya looked up, confused. "I was looking for someone," she continued. "Someone who reminded me of what real grace looks like." And then, Margaret told her everything. How she'd read about Zaria in a local newspaper 2 years ago about the scholarship she declined to care for her dying mother. How she'd kept that clipping in her purse. How something about Zaria's story stayed with her. "You didn't save me that night," Margaret said. "You saved me long before." And for the first time in a long time, Zaria had no words. Just tears. And something deep in her chest finally beginning to heal. The next morning, Elliot Riker did something entirely out of character. No tailored suit, no assistant trailing behind, no press release in hand. Just him standing outside the little diner where the storm had changed everything with 2 steaming cups of coffee. One black. One light and sweet, the way Zaria liked it. He stepped inside. The bell jingled softly. Zaria looked up from behind the counter, flour on her apron, the scent of cinnamon and fresh bread in the air. She blinked, caught off guard. Not by the sight of him but by what he was holding. "You came back," she said. "Yeah," Elliot replied, offering her the cup. "Didn't know what you'd like, so I got both." Zaria raised an eyebrow but took the sweet one. Smart choice. They sat in a booth tucked near the window. Outside, the snow had softened into slush, and the world was beginning to move again. But inside, it was quiet. Still. Elliot leaned forward. For once, he wasn't talking numbers. He wasn't pitching. He was listening. Zaria told him about her life, about losing her mother at 19, and walking away from a full-ride scholarship to care for her grandmother. About long nights, 2 jobs, and bills that always came early. About the diner where she'd been serving coffee and kindness for years without expecting anything in return. "You could have left," Elliot said. "You could have taken that scholarship, changed your life." Zaria smiled. "I did change it. Just, in a way people don't always notice." He looked at her differently then, not with curiosity or guilt, but with something like admiration. Maybe even something more. "I've built my life around solving problems," Elliot said. "But I can't code what you do. The way you see people, the way you make them feel seen. That's real power." She shrugged. "It's just who I am." Later that afternoon, he came back. This time with a plan. A new scholarship fund, not in his name, not for headlines, but named after Zaria's mother, Lena's light. For students like Zaria, overlooked, underestimated, extraordinary. "And I want you to run it," he said. "Lead it, shape it, be its face." Zaria stared at him. "You sure you want a black waitress fronting your $1 billion project?" Elliot didn't hesitate. "I want Zaria Monroe, exactly as she is." And just like that, the world shifted again. Not because of power, or money, or fame, but because one woman's quiet strength finally had a place to shine. And someone finally chose to stand beside her instead of in her way. The next few days passed in a blur of headlines, meetings, and late-night thinking. Zaria wasn't the type to chase the spotlight, but now, it was chasing her. Her face was suddenly everywhere. Local news, national talk shows, social media threads debating whether a black waitress belonged in philanthropy leadership. Some praised her strength and authenticity, others called her a publicity pawn. But through all the noise, Zaria focused on the mission. Elliot had named the project Lena's Light after Zaria's late mother. The scholarship fund was meant to uplift students with stories like Zaria's, those who had sacrificed, persevered, and kept going even when the world gave them no reason to. Zaria read the proposal line by line. She highlighted vague language, rewrote entire paragraphs. She didn't just want to be a face, she wanted this to work. At meetings, she asked the tough questions. Why weren't community colleges included? Where was the outreach plan for underserved neighborhoods? Why did every photo in the brochure feature smiling kids but no real data? People blinked. Elliot grinned. This was why he chose her. But still, there were moments of doubt. Late at night, sitting alone with a cup of lukewarm tea, Zaria would wonder if she was enough. If people would ever see past the label they'd given her, the waitress who got lucky. So she went to the only place that grounded her, her mother's grave. The snow had fallen quietly overnight, blanketing the cemetery in soft white. Zaria stood still, bundled in a simple coat, her breath forming clouds in the air. "Mama," she whispered, They're giving me a seat at the table. But I want to make a new table, one where people like us don't need permission to sit. She closed her eyes, felt the silence around her, heavy but warm, and somehow, she knew her mother would have told her to go all in. The next morning, Zarya walked into Elliot's office not like a guest, but like someone claiming her space. "I'm ready," she said. Elliot looked up, surprised. "You sure?" "I'm sure, but this isn't just PR. I want real change, and I'm not interested in being anyone's token." He nodded slowly. "Good. Because I'm not interested in anything less than your full voice." They shook hands, not as boss and employee but as partners. That was the day Zarya Monroe stepped into a role no one saw coming, except maybe her mother. And she was just getting started. The first snow of December came early that year. Flakes danced down from a silver sky, layering the streets of Aspen in quiet white. The world felt slower, softer, like it was holding its breath. Zarya stood outside the community center where Lena's Light had just finished its first scholarship ceremony. The lights inside still glowed, and the laughter of students echoed behind her. But she needed a moment of stillness. She wrapped her coat tighter, her gloved hands holding a cup of hot cider, the kind Margaret insisted was the secret to surviving winter. Behind her, footsteps approached. She didn't need to turn around. "You always wear cologne like you're trying to impress a room full of Fortune 500 CEOs, she said, smiling. Elliot chuckled. Force of habit. He joined her by the railing, hands in his coat pockets, eyes fixed on the falling snow. "Tonight was something." Zarya nodded. "They deserve it, every one of them." "They got more than a scholarship," he said. "They got you, your story, your strength. That changes people." She looked up at him, her expression soft but certain. "This started because of your mother." He shook his head. "No. This started because you saw someone the world ignored, and because you didn't wait for permission to care." They stood in silence for a beat, watching the snow thicken over the trees. Then Elliot cleared his throat. "I have one more thing to ask you tonight." Zarya raised an eyebrow. "If you're about to pitch another program, at least let me finish my cider first." He didn't laugh. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small velvet box. No flash, no crowd. Just two people, under a quiet sky, where everything began. Her breath caught. "You changed my life, Zarya Monroe," he said. "Not by trying, but by being exactly who you are. You've seen the worst of me, and somehow, you stayed. You've challenged me, humbled me, inspired me. I don't want a future that doesn't have you in it." He opened the box. A simple, elegant ring. No diamonds screaming status. Just a soft gold band with a small sapphire deep and steady, like her gaze. Zarya stared at it, then at him. "Elliot," she whispered, tears forming. "I'm not a prize." "I know," he said. "I'm the lucky one." A gust of wind blew snow into her curls. She laughed through her tears, nodded once, and held out her hand. "Yes." There, under the falling snow, the woman who was once dismissed became the center of someone's world. And the man who had everything finally had what mattered most. Years later, people would still talk about how Lena's Light changed lives, not just through the scholarships or the programs, but through the woman at its heart. Zarya Monroe. The waitress who became a leader, the voice no one expected, but everyone learned to follow. She didn't just open doors, she taught people how to build them from scratch, and then she handed them the tools. But Zarya never saw herself as a hero. She still visited the diner once a week, still brought warm socks to the shelters every winter, still wrote thank you notes by hand to every donor, no matter how small the gift. Still called Margaret every Sunday morning, just to hear her laugh. Elliot stood beside her at every step, but he never stood in front of her. He learned to lead by stepping back, to listen more than he spoke, and to love not with grand gestures but with presence, humility, and respect. They didn't build a legacy with noise, they built it with impact. One morning, standing before a group of first-generation students at a town hall, Zarya shared what she'd learned. "You're going to be underestimated," she said, voice steady. "You'll walk into rooms where no one expects you to lead. You'll be spoken over, dismissed. You'll be told you need to change to be taken seriously. She looked around the room, her eyes meeting theirs one by one. Don't believe them. A pause. You don't have to shout to be powerful. You don't have to shrink to be accepted. And you never have to apologize for being who you are. I didn't get here because I changed myself. I got here because I refused to. Applause didn't come fast. It came slow, real, deep, the kind that came from people who saw themselves in her. Afterward, a young girl approached her, maybe 15, nervous, clutching a small notebook. She whispered, "Do you think someone like me could do what you did?" Zaria smiled, leaned in close, and said gently, "Baby girl, you already are. You just haven't been told yet. And now to you, watching this. If this story moved you, if it made you see something differently, feel something more deeply, don't just scroll on. Share it. Let someone else feel seen. Because stories like Zaria's aren't rare. They're just rarely told. This is Hidden Worth. And this was a Black story worth remembering. Subscribe for more powerful true stories, and remember, sometimes, the person you overlook is the one who can change everything.